pray that at the end of this, we will all be enlightened, even if we disagree on some things. At the end of it, we will leave here enlightened, our eyes opened, and our knowledge stimulated with respect to the issue tonight. So, as I always do, let's start on your right foot, and let's start with prayer. I'd ask our General Superintendent, Dr. Joel Cumberbatch, to do that for us this evening.
Good evening, everybody. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for the privilege to come together to discuss matters of interest. We pray your blessings and your direction on the moderator and each panelist. And as he said, may it be a means of enlightenment and a means of stimulating us as well to be all that we can be for you and to better serve our generation. So we give you thanks and may your blessings rest and abide with us all now and forever. Amen.
Amen. So I just want to, just give me a second here. I just want to share this song with you so we can kind of set the scene. And as we go into our discussion this evening. So it's really a song that talks about the whole world, a wonderful world. And so let's share that song at this moment. Just give me a second here. Right. So give me a second, let me change that. Okay. So I hope you all are well geared up for this discussion, and at some point in time, we will have participation by the audience, and I hope that you would ask your questions and you would partake fully in this discussion this evening. So this is a song, I want to set the scene. It's really about a wonderful world by Louis Armstrong. It's a wonderful world. And this is the scene for the discussion this evening. We're talking about the genesis of man, biblical fact or fiction. So for those who don't know, my name is Emmanuel Joseph. I'm the director of the men's ministry here at Cayfield Wesleyan Holiness Church. I'm your moderator for this evening. And we have an eminent panel to discuss this issue this evening. So let's start with the panelists, our Reverend Dr. Joel Cumberbatch, who you heard from earlier during the prayer. He's the General Superintendent of the Wesleyan Church in the Caribbean. And we also have the Reverend Robin Downs, and he's a tutor in hermeneutics and Old Testament studies. We also have our, sorry? Did somebody say something? Okay. And we also have the Reverend Dr. John Rogers. He's a tutor in Old Testament studies. So that is our panel for this evening. And as the panelists are aware, each one will make some opening remarks with respect to their work and themselves before we get into the meat of the matter. So let's start with our Dr. John Rogers, and he will make his remarks at this time.
Thank you very much, sir. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
First of all, let me say how much of a pleasure it is for me to be with you, sharing in this forum. And the other two panelists I happen to know very well. I sat in class with one and I taught alongside another. Just a correction, I'm not a tutor at Codrington anymore. I haven't taught there since 2015 because of parish duties, etc. However, it is indeed a pleasure to be here. I suspect that some recent mumblings in the press and so on have prompted the topic for tonight. But, you know, we give thanks to God that we're able to gather and to reflect on these things. And I want to encourage the men's ministry to continue their work in shedding abroad the light of Christ to those whom they're called to proclaim it to. So I'll just stop there for now and then I'll deal with other things later.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And next is our Reverend Downs.
Good evening to you, the moderator, and to my fellow panelists. I consider myself a student of the Bible. I have a passion for Bible study. And that is why I pursued theological studies first at the Caribbean Wesleyan College. But as fate would have it, in about 1994, the college closed. And my world was turned upside down because my heart really was set on that journey. But it was during, I think, the summer or something like that of 1995. I had an idea that I should pursue theological studies at Codrington College. And I registered. I knew that a lot of my friends and perhaps colleagues would have thought the idea a crazy idea. And I enrolled in Codrington College 1995 as a part-time student. The next 5 years were some of my most enjoyable years. After graduating in 2000 as a part-time student, as I said, it would have taken 5 years. I had the itch. So I went back to Codrington College and I started the journey for the master's, because I reasoned, why read for nothing when you can read for something? That was my reasoning. I would say that during my time, I had the privilege of sitting under a most eminent Old Testament scholar in the most reverend, he was the Archbishop then, I think, the most Reverend Dr. John Holder, whom I learned much from, though not always in agreement with his views. And so my journey has been quite interesting, quite enlightening. And I think tonight, therefore, having done quite a number of Old Testament courses under Dr. Holder, I feel that I have some knowledge that I can share tonight. And I hope that my contribution, therefore, would be enlightening to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Downs. And now, to put the icing on the cake, our Reverend Dr. Joel Cumberbatch.
Well, I by no stretch of the imagination, I'm an Old Testament specialist. But I think the collective experiences and the studies over the years would at least have prepared me to make some meaningful contribution. And I look forward to the discussion myself. Happy to share the forum with my two colleagues.
Thank you so much. So as I said from the beginning, that we will have a discussion and then we will have the audience participate. So you can ask your questions, you can make your comments. And one thing I want you to do is to be very respectful in everything that you say tonight, because our God is not a God of confusion or rancor. So just want to put that out there. So we can agree to disagree. But at the end of the day, let us see how much of a common ground we can come to, and we should learn from each other at the end of the evening. So what I want to do is start the ball rolling with our John Rogers. And obviously, I want you to reflect on what one would consider the controversial statement that you made, and kind of put it into context and contextualize it. And so we can have a foundation by which we can move forward. at this time.
Thank you, sir. All right, first of all, what I would wish for us to set out from the very beginning is that the Bible is a very precious document. It is a document upon which our faith is built as Christians. It's a document upon which the faith of the Old Testament community was built. But there are certain basic things that we must recognize about the text is that, one, the Bible is a book of theology. It is a book of a people's relationship or their understanding of their relationship with God and what their God would have them do in relation to each other and to the world that he created. And so, because it's a book of theology, it is not necessarily a history book or a science book. So it doesn't seek to answer the questions that history and science seek to answer. It does not necessarily seek to answer how, when, where, or even who. It seeks to answer the question why. And therefore, it is a document that speaks not to necessarily to historical facts, but to truths that a community believed about their relationship with their God and their God in relation to them and the world. And that basically sets the basis of what I would have said 2 Sundays ago. And let me just say from the outset that I'm not upset with anyone who is critical of what I said or is upset about what I said, because I do recognize that such information is foreign to many people and things that they would not necessarily hear from a pulpit, etc. But I'm also cognizant that we live in an age where the things we may have encountered in seminary are no longer confined to the walls of the seminary, are very accessible at the click of a button. And so we would be prudent as Christian teachers and preachers to recognize this and recognize that, as Johann Henry Richard once said, if we do as our fathers do, we will not do as our fathers did, which means that the things that work for a particular group of teachers may not necessarily work for this one, similar to what Jesus would have encountered in his time, because his ministry was very volatile because he was bringing something new to the people that they did not expect to come from a teacher of religion. And therefore he became, for some, Beelzebub. He became one who was not operating in the context of what God would have expected him to do. Now, regard to this, I'm not sure, I didn't see the clip on television, so I'm not sure how much they gave, but I do know that I would have mentioned that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are myth. And I would not have expounded on it at the same time, but I did so later in the message when I was speaking about the dangers of literalism. And I'll just quote what I said about literalism. It was African Heritage Sunday for us, and I was making mention of the contribution of Bishop Colenso of South Africa. He was an Englishman trained in Oxford, but was sent to be Bishop of South Africa. And there he formed a strong relationship with the Zulus. And he was one who was in the 19th century very forceful in the critical examination of Holy Scripture. And critical here, according to the Oxford Dictionary, speaks of exegesis, that to study the book critically. And so I said this in the sermon which I made. That is why I could tell you this morning that we usually tell students at Codrington that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are myth, because it is through critical study that we've come to this premise. It does not negate the work of God in creation. It does not negate God's continual work in human history. But what it says is that we recognize that a lot of what is in Genesis 1 to 11 are stories, some borrowed from other civilizations that would have existed before to make points about God. And I've said before, in the church and in the study of theology, the ancients did not count history as a collection of facts, but they regarded history as a collection of truths. The truth is what they're trying to convey, and the truth can be presented in a myth. It is the truth that they're trying to project, quote unquote. Now, I know that the word myth may have caused a little problem for people because in our context, in our world today, the word myth means that just dismiss everything. But that is not what myth means in the context of theological studies. Myth comes from the Latin mythos, and it can mean three different things. It can be stories about gods and goddesses, which the Genesis 1 through to 11 is not. It can be stories about rituals and rites, which it doesn't really deal with. But the third meaning of myth from the Latin, is that it is a story which expresses a truth about human life that cannot adequately be described by history or science. And that is the context in which I use the term myth, and which it is used generally in biblical studies. Now, there's more that can be said of the stories in Genesis 1 through to 11, but they're primarily referred to as what we refer to as a primeval history. And what it really means is that the actual history of the people of Israel begins with the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. But in order to set this people in the context of the world, the writers of the text had to show how this group of people is related to the world. And that is what Genesis 1 through to 11 seeks to do. And so it shapes what we refer to as a primeval history leading up to the call of Abraham, which is the actual story of the Hebrew people who will eventually emerge as the Jews and into the Christian era. So I'll stop there for now, but just to reinforce the point that the Bible is a book of theology and not necessarily a book of history or science. And so it does not seek to deal with the same questions that history and science seeks to deal with.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Reverend Downs, can you jump in here?
Yes, certainly. Again, I want to say thanks, and indeed, I'm happy to be able to share this forum tonight. You said that it is more about the who and not the what. And I could agree.
More about the why, not
the why.
the
So
what.
sorry, the why,
Yeah.
right? And not so much the who and the what. I see it slightly different. While I agree that the theology is of most importance, yet that theology is often anchored in history. And while we may agree that the historian, the biblical historian, if you could call them that, may not necessarily be concerned about all the details of history. He's only concerned about his theological viewpoint and how the history could support that viewpoint. I still think that to dismiss the claims or the historical claims could create a sense of doubt and uncertainty. All right, when I consider the whole biblical narrative in first 11 chapters of Genesis, and I then look through the scriptures, right down even to the New Testament, there is a sense in which the views of the writers of the New Testament are consistent in the understanding that these events that are written about in the first 11 chapters are really historical. And Jesus, for example, made reference to Noah in a sense that reflects history. The same thing was done by the writer of the Hebrews. So I think that it is not very accurate to dismiss all the details as unhistorical, but to carefully look through the text And I would agree that there may be aspects of the text that may not necessarily be intended to give specifics in terms of history, but to dismiss the whole as unhistorical may be a little misleading. And I stop there for now.
Okay, so before I get to Dr. Cumberbatch, I want to hear from Rogers. Reverend Rogers, you want to respond?
As I pointed out, historical in the sense may not necessarily mean facts. It may mean truths, and you can have. We're not in a position to measure the historical context of the primeval history. For example, even the story of creation, for example, because technically no one was there to record it. History as a discipline requires actual evidence and actually seeing it, actually being there, and memory, which we do not have, or in more recent times, archaeological proof, which we do not have. So that's why I said it is history in the sense that it conveys the truth, and it is the history of these people. So when they refer to it later on, that is their history. But remember, the discipline of history is a recent discipline within the context of academia when we're dealing with old ancient texts like this. So I get your point, and there may be historical truths, but there's also the possibility, as I would usually say, the Bible is a very recent document in the ancient Near Eastern context. And so what we have, as I would have mentioned in the sermon, are parallels with other things. And what people basically did was simply shape the narrative that is in existence to match the worldview and their understanding at the time. So there is something there, but I was making the point that history for them is not necessarily history for us. So they will refer to it as though it was real. It's their truth.
Thank you so much. A few things before we move on. For those who joined us late, you will get an opportunity to take part, but you just hold strain a bit till we get a little further into our discussion. And I want to just throw here that we will get back to this whole issue of the creation, because our subject tonight is the genesis of man, biblical fact or fiction. I want to dig a little deeper into that because I want to take upon what Reverend Rogers said about archaeological proof and so on. So on to our Reverend Cumberbatch.
Yes, Mr. Moderator. Firstly, let me indicate that I did not have the privilege to hear what Reverend Rogers said in his sermon. I was really stretched out over that period. So I can't fully comment on that apart from bits and pieces you heard here and there. Actually, though, I think that Reverend Dung stole my thunder to some extent, because while it is true that the Bible may be heavy in theology, I don't think you can discount the historical either. So it's a question of how far you go with that one. I remember at Covington, the history professor saying that history, sometimes we tend to see history as this dull subject, just a collection of facts. So he said, but history is not just a collection of facts, but the historian, by virtue of his position, has a right to assess and even make projections. And I found that very, very interesting then, and I still find it interesting now. What I would be interested though in finding out specifically, what are those specific areas, that we are not bringing into the historical perspective as actual facts, because that has implications too for a lot of things. The historical Jesus. I mean, people believe in Jesus, but was he a historical figure? Or he was just a representation of goodness and all the other things. And I believe, and no, it's probably leading to the discussion. It was Adam an actual person? Was Eve an actual person? And I believe that these things are striking because that dimension is right there in the early aspect of the book. So I would tend to agree with Reverend Downs that that historical element is also very, very important. And the meat of the question is, how did human beings come into being? Was Adam the first person created? Was Adam a mythological figure? And the truth is that has much implications though for a number of the other Christian doctrines that we embrace. The concept of the fall. I know that not every theological school embraces the concept of fall, right? But there's a view that Adam was created holy and that he fell from that state of holiness, okay? It has implications for what we consider the first Adam, the second Adam. Who's the first Adam? Who's the second Adam? But it also raises the question, though, in terms of the authorship of the book. How did that person receive that information? And it has wider implications for the whole question of inspiration of Scripture, the canon of Scripture, and so many other things that I have no doubt will come up as we go down through the discussion.
Okay, some very provocative questions. So we're going to get to that, but we want to pivot back to the whole issue of the genesis of man, whether the fact or fiction, and look at whether or not there's any scientific evidence to prove any of this in respect of the genesis of man. I want to throw that out. Who is going to jump on it first? See, Reverend Rogers give me a smile, so I suspect that a few.
The fundamental truth for us as Christian people is that God created the heavens and the earth, and God created humanity. I don't think there's any shadow of turning where that is concerned. That is the truth that the book of Genesis seeks to project, that God created. The question of how may be a challenge because, well, for those of us who have studied in theological college or those of us who have read a little further, we would acknowledge that the book of Genesis presents two accounts of creation, with Genesis 2 being regarded as the more primitive of the two accounts, where God comes to a garden, it is barren because rain had not yet fallen. And then a mist comes up from the earth and he forms man from the dust, Adam. And he said he will make a helper for man, but he creates the animals. And then Adam cannot find a helper amongst the animals. Then he plants a garden around Adam. And when Adam cannot find a helper, God puts him to sleep and creates woman. And that is what we refer to as the primitive story. The Genesis 1 story projects something a little different, where the creation is more ordered and God is more transcendental in the sense that he speaks and it happens. And in this story, rather than a separation of the creation of man and woman are created last and not first, and they're created together as just male and female. The names Adam and Eve turn up in Genesis 2. And Adam may simply be a play on Adama, which means dust, and Eve being the first woman, or Ish man and Isha, woman. And so even amongst the compilers of the text, you get two different sources, and I'm going to, if time permits, go on with that source. You get two different sources presenting two separate accounts of how the order of creation would have taken place. Now, in Christian apologetics, we may argue that Genesis 2 is really an explanation of Genesis 1, etc. And I've seen that being presented where the questions you have asked, for example, the first Adam and the second Adam, some will argue that the first Adam is what was created in Genesis 2 on the fourth day, and then the second Adam was to come later on, which presented itself in Christ and so on. As you would recognize, those are theological interpretations of the text, and which is precisely what I was saying from the beginning, that we come to these texts and we ask the question, why? And for example, in Genesis 2, why do we get this story about man being created from the dust and the whole notion of woman? And we're told that when the man meets the woman, he says, at last, this is bone of my bone. The very basic question that may be answered there is, why men go so foolish behind women? And, you know, as Percy Sledge said, they give up all their comforts and sleep in the rain and do all kinds of things. The ancients would have probably be dealing with that notion as well, to understand what's the relationship between the sexes, and basic questions that were pertinent to them at the time. But what Genesis 1 and 2 do state emphatically is that God created. And he created humanity to serve him. He created humanity to enjoy the beauty of his creation and to care for it. That's the basic message there.
Okay. Reverend Downs?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. In the sense that that is the message of Genesis. As I reflected on these 11 chapters, I like how the text began. In the beginning, God. The first 4 words, to my mind, establish beyond doubt the perspective of the writer. If, as Reverend Roger said, the writers are collectors or compilers, depending on one's perspective. And we know the GETDP situation. But it establishes beyond doubt. And it doesn't seek to explain who God is or to prove that God exists. It declares it as a fact. In the beginning, God. The next thing that happens is that this God appears as creator. And that theme runs right through not just Genesis. As a matter of fact, we can trace it through the entire Bible. So between Genesis 1 and Revelation 22, on numerous occasions, the theme is explained or propagated that God is creator. So we have no doubt as to the position, the theological position of the writer or compilers, if you want to accommodate compilers of Genesis. There's no dispute in terms of what the theological perspective and understanding is. What I find interesting as well is that when it comes to the New Testament, and you come across a book like St. John's Gospel, it begins with almost the same identical structure. In the beginning, so it starts almost identical to Genesis, was the Word. And it seems as though the Apostle John is making the claim that what he's about to say parallels what was written in Genesis chapter 1. So he said, in the beginning was the Word, and if I should just leave out what he said immediately after, he said, and the Word was God. So established as a foundation was the fact that God exists. And because God exists, and between Genesis and Revelation, God is presented in the Bible as sovereign. He's the boss. He's the main star. He's in charge. And it is this God that has all rights to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and however he wants. And he's basically unchallenged throughout our scripture. And to me, that is significant. So that the whole idea of creation is presented as a reality, even if we disagree on the mechanism. One thing that we can be assured of, scripture is filled with statements that support the idea that God is sovereign and God is creator. And that would be my contribution at this time.
Okay, could we wrap this around the notion that the Bible is a book of faith, and also pivot that to whether we have any hard evidence that what the Bible says about the genesis of man has been proven?
And you want my response to that?
And then
Okay.
Reverend Cumberbatch could jump in.
Okay. Now, archaeology and science are interesting and are very essential. I would say that they're essential disciplines. But like everything else, very often it is left to the scholars or the experts to interpret the data. So like somebody said, you can discover a fossil, but what you make of the fossil is dependent now of the interpretation of the information. So the fossil is a fact, but the interpretation is what you can get variations of. And I think Reverend Rogers did make some kind of reference to this, not in terms of fossils. Similarly, when we speak of archaeological discoveries, what is discovered is factual. That pot that you discover, that coin that you discover is a fact of history. How it is interpreted in terms of what is its meaning is what could be interpreted differently. Just recently, I was doing a study on Revelation, and I saw a coin that was said to be minted during the reign of Nero. And it showed Nero, they showed this coin, a male figure was facing a female figure. All right, that's a fact. Now, the interpretation that the writer gave was that that was Nero facing his mother. All right, so that is an interpretation. That is not necessarily the fact. So I made this point because there is evidence, for example, in my research, I particularly look at the flood, and I look at the chapter 11 story of the Tower of Babel. And there is research, there are discoveries that seem to support the fact that these events are historical. Now, for example, the flood. Reverend Rogers would have made mention of the fact that there are other flood stories. And scholars usually interpret this as an indication that these are all fake stories, or these are all mythological stories. But there's another interpretation. The fact that the Chinese, the fact that the Native Americans, the fact that so many other persons had their recollection or projected a recollection of a flood would seem to suggest that this was an authentic historical event. Now, even science suggests that there would have been some measure of a universal flood. I read an article recently as I was prepared for this, interestingly it was the BBC magazine on this whole issue of the flood. And the writer made an interesting observation and comment. He said that there was a flood, a universal flood, there's no doubt. All right, so he established that there was a universal flood. But then he concluded, but the stories that we have are mythological. I found that to be real interesting because here he has gone into the realm of interpretation. So he acknowledged that there was a universal flood, a global flood. But then he proceeded to interpret the archaeological evidence, scientific evidence, whatever you may call it. He proceeded to say, yes, that was true, but the biblical and other narratives are all mythological. I find that to be rather interesting.
All right, thank you so much for that contribution. And Reverend Cumberbatch.
Sir, I'm not an expert when it comes to scientific. So I bow at the feet of those who are more versed in that area. I too was doing some reading, and one person was making the point that when you look at the sedimentary rocks and things like that all across the world, it is some evidence that there had to be some global flood. And then other persons say, well, when it talks about the whole world, it most likely was within the confines of where Noah was. So you get differences of opinion on that. But what I would say though, using that example, I probably will use some theological affirmations and to support the historicity of the flood, because Jesus himself made reference to that, and I think it's in Matthew 24. And he talked about what would happen and the attitudes of people, that they would behave just like what happened prior to the flood, when they all came and were washed away. And I don't think that was just a story. It might be story in the sense of the story of a people. Those of us who are into research, qualitative research and things like that, research is about the story of a people. So it's not a story now just in terms of a fable or anything like that, but story in terms of describing the actuality and the experiences of people. So I found that interesting because Jesus himself, because if we discount that, and Jesus is God, Jesus is the Messiah. If you put a question mark against what he said, then a lot of what we hold to will collapse. Jesus made reference to that flood, which suggests to me that there had to be something historical, documented, understood among the Jews, because Jesus himself was a Jew, ingrained in their writings, and that they understood that to be an actual event. But before I continue with that, sir, with your permission, when you talked about the scientific evidence with respect to man, I thought you were going to go down the road of evolution, because you can't talk about the evidence without bringing in the other side. It is either creationism versus evolution. I don't know if we deliberately sidestep that or what, but that is a real issue in this debate. And core to the evolutionary position, particularly with regards to man's beginning, is that man evolved from some lesser species. And that is a whole big debate. Certainly, as was enunciated by the others, I believe most of us would hold to the creation story. Although persons would argue that there's some element of evolution in terms of other aspects of creation. And they would argue like this: well, a butterfly does not just become a butterfly. There's a process, it evolves. But we do not see any evidence, as some will want us to believe, that man sprung from a chimpanzee. What happened that evolutionary process stopped? But again, I'm not a specialist in that area, but I know that is a real issue And there are persons who would like to project that on us. It comes out in literature, it comes out in movies, it comes out in general communication. But as people of faith and all those mainline religions hold to most of them, hold to the fact that the material world, mankind generally, universe came about as an act of God, a creative act of God. So I just thought of slip that inside there.
I was going to get to that, but I want us to, before we get to Reverend Rogers, and then we will engage the audience shortly. I wanted us also to consider, and you can actually link that into the evolution issue, that there are other books which have been left out of the Bible and non-canonical, as they will say, books like the Maccabees and the Esther and all different kind of books which have accounts. So are these books really deserve being left out to give you a broader picture of what the events of mankind, and how can we justify this in our knowledge, to gain more knowledge and to be enlightened about what the events of the past in terms of man's genesis.
Well, if I may respond to that, Emmanuel, the truth is, this is such an interesting discussion, right? And that is why, as leaders of the church, we have to study, we have to encourage people to study as well, because church life, I suppose for the average person, they just want to know that their relationship is good with God. They live on a day-to-day basis. But those of us who are teachers and leaders, we have a responsibility to study.
Yeah.
And a responsibility to address some of the questions and concerns that people legitimately have. But this is one of the challenging areas. Yeah? The whole canon of scripture. Because the truth is, initially, some of the books that were left out were included, and then some that were in were left out.
Yeah.
And I can only say it may be a simplistic way of putting it, because it has certainly to do with the whole matter of the inspiration of scripture. I can only say that God in his wisdom, it's amazing how God in his wisdom guided the men of faith. Because remember, when the canons were put together, just like what is happening now, there's a proliferation of literature all over the place. Take the New Testament. People were writing, more literature is being produced today than ever. Because something is published in the newspaper does not mean that it is right or authentic. Or because somebody writes a book does not mean what is written is authentic. So somebody has to apply certain measuring rods. Yeah? Certainly in the case of the disciples, well, one will figure, well, anybody knows about Jesus and his work, it would have to be those who were close to him, who spent 3 long years with him, at least. Let us hear from those persons. So they had to go through a process, I would say a rigorous process. And I would only say simplicity, it's amazing how God guided those men to put the canon together. Now, with respect, I remember when I was at Codrington, can't remember the course, but one of the interesting projects we had to do was to examine one of the canonical books, the apocryphal books, right? Look at some of the doctrines and some of the, what quote unquote truths coming out of some of those books, and to compare them with what we may consider to be some of the normal canonical books with what we might consider to be orthodox teachings and doctrines. And that was pretty interesting. Now, it is said, though, that some of the books, as you know very well know, maybe truth in the sense of historical information and things like that. But somehow, guided by the church, the church did not think that they were meant for what? How should I put it? That they were meant as tenets of faith, inspired tenets of faith. Now, part of the challenge you have, though, as you know, that some of those books are endorsed by some aspects of the Christian church.
Yeah.
Right? Of course, you would go to church and you would hear in some denominations reading from Ecclesiasticus, right? In other settings, you may hear reference made to Maccabees. But as you know, most of the evangelical churches would not support the apocryphal books. But it's a very interesting, I don't have all the answers. It's a very interesting area of study.
But I jump in here
Very
before
interesting
Robert
area of
Rogers.
study.
I know Robert Rogers have a lot to say on this, but could I just put in a little bit?
Okay.
Yeah, and I want to differ a little bit from my general superintendent. I'm one of the evangelicals that see immense value in those, what some people call Deuterocanonical books. For example.
No, I said
really
most. I said most.
Yeah,
most.
right.
I said most, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Most would not. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm one of those, for example, that believe that if you don't read the Maccabees, especially the first book of the Maccabees, your interpretation of the book of Daniel is going to be greatly skewed. Okay. Also, having done a course called Wisdom Literature with the Most Reverend Dr. John Holder, one of the things that we discover with a book like Sirach, for example, is the great treasure chest of wisdom that is found in that book. Now, the whole idea of the canon is very political. For example, many of those books were not written or believed to be written in Palestine. It is like if nothing that is from outside of Palestine cannot be good. No good can come out of Nazareth. Is that kind of idea. So a lot of those books were rejected, one, because they were perhaps not written in Palestine, and secondly, the dates. If the books were not written by a particular date, then they were considered not as valuable. But in reading those books, having read those books, they are of immense value. And while I won't get up on morning and preach from Maccabees, when I do my presentation on Daniel, the book of Daniel, you will definitely hear me quoting the book of Maccabees. My contribution.
Yeah, so before we get to Rogers, I want to just put it out here that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible that we adhere to, make reference in several occasions to these same books, right? But they did not go into details, but they pivoted them. And that is, to my mind, very intriguing, but yet it is not in the Bible. Yes. So we have a lot to bite off. We have a lot to learn. And I think that I believe that a lot of our church leaders are shortchanging their congregations in not expounding these truths or these events, okay? Because they probably figured out they may become unpopular. But we need to let our congregations know the whole picture, right? So over to you, Reverend Rogers.
Right. To agree with Superintendent Cumberbatch and Reverend Downs, what we refer to as the Apocrypha. You see, the Old Testament, the canon of the Old Testament was not compiled until the year 100 AD. This is well after the death of Christ. So when Christ was alive, there was no compilation of texts known as the Old Testament. The elders came together at a council in Turkey, Jamnia, and determined which books will form their canon or their rule of life. And they did it in a very ad hoc way. Those books which defiled the hands were considered sacred, and only those written in Hebrew, but because by then Hebrew was considered the sacred language. Books like Sirach, though it was initially written in Hebrew, his grandson translated it into Greek, and that became the popular version. And so that was not accepted. But as Reverend Downs said, the book of Sirach in particular contains a lot of wisdom that can be very useful, especially in this pandemic. Because it's Sirach 38, verse 1 and following, which we use for the feast of St. Luke, the patron of physicians, which says, honor your physician because his gift comes from God. Honor the pharmacist because it's God who inspires him to make the potions to keep you healthy. There are times when life and death lie in the hands of the physician. and the wise person would not despise him. And so those things, those kernels of wisdom would be helpful at this point in time. But I should point out here for us as Christians to remember that the Old Testament was compiled as a canon to keep it out of the hands of Christians from corrupting it. I just thought that.
Sir, I think an interesting though additional dimension though, because we talk about the closed canon, because you know people are always inspired, and even in church circles, people tell you, "Well, I have received this from God." People are always documenting, and sometimes what they come up with, they're prone to put it on par with what is in the canon. And the question is, where do we draw the line? Yeah, because these are real contemporary things that we have to deal with now. You have the prophets and the prophetesses who tell you they're hearing from God. They're speaking, they're writing. And the danger is, how do we compare with that what is in the canon? Is the canon closed? Yeah? I think that is one of the contemporary issues that we have to deal with. Because while we were talking about the Apocrypha, there are hundreds of other literatures out there, as you very well know. So where do we stop? Where do we draw the line? And you're talking now about faith, a body, a canon, because the canon by definition suggests a rod or rule, something that effect. Where do we stop? It certainly can't be a free for all. That's the challenge that we have as leaders.
Thank you so much. Now we will engage the audience, our virtual audience. And as I said earlier, just be respectful in everything that you say this evening. And you could ask your questions or you can make your comments.
Yes, could I begin, please?
Okay, and your name?
Manuel Joseph.
Yes.
All right, thank you for allowing me to make a comment.
Yeah. Could you make
your
name, sir?
Yes, I am Joseph Buckland.
Okay.
Joseph from Jamaica. I want to ask a question. Did Jesus Christ accept the creation account in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 as a literal historical event? And I'm basing this question on what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 6, when he was answering a question asked him by the Pharisees. Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? That is obviously a reference to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And Jesus continues and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh, which is a reference to Genesis 2, verse 24. So my point is this. Jesus puts both creation accounts together, says that God is the one who said this, and he uses in the Greek language, when it is written by Matthew, the indicative mood when he is using the verbs. And in the indicative mood, it is the mood of asserting facts. So I want to know from this scripture, if the panelists believe that Jesus Christ accepted the creation account in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 as a literal historical event revealed by God.
Well, certainly, I believe that.
Yeah,
that would be my position.
Right. It seems rather short to me as well.
As I would have pointed out earlier, the community of Jesus and the community of the Old Testament leading into the New Testament held these stories as a part of their history, as a part of their fundamental truths. And so they would speak to them as historical accounts. So it's not surprising that Jesus did that as well. It is what the community did.
So could I just ask one more question and then I'll keep quiet? So my follow-up question to that is, if we as Christians believe that Jesus is God revealed in the flesh, then shouldn't we accept what Jesus says as being true, as being factual, that there was an actual creation done by God as written in the book of Genesis of the first man and the first woman, and that he joined them together and ordained the institution of marriage? Yes, that's the question.
I don't think
I think
anyone has refuted that God created humanity, and the truth being conveyed in Genesis 1 and 2 is that God called human beings to exist in relationship as male and female and blessed them as such. I think that is a truth, a fundamental truth of the document.
And that I would agree with as well.
Okay, so, right. So we have some other participants. We have Melva Weeks. She had her hands up, Melva, and then Veronica, and then we'll read from some questions in the chat. Melva?
Yes, please. My question is a question that I think I picked up when Dr. Rogers was speaking. In his earlier discourse, he indicated that the first set of narratives of Genesis were history for the people then, but not necessarily for us. I think that is what I heard. So if that is actually the case, then my question would be, when God indicated then that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through Abraham, is this to be taken as was said, or are we misguided in our understanding that it ripples down to us as well?
Thank you very much. You may be conflating two things. As I mentioned, Genesis 1 to 11 is what we refer to as the primeval history. Genesis 12 and following goes into the patriarchal history. The patriarchal history is what we believe to, which picks up on the historical development of these people called Israel. The primeval history seeks to put them in context of the world history at the point in time. Now, as I mentioned, and you would rightly noted, for them it is history because their history is not the discipline that we refer to as history. Their history is truth. And just like, I don't want to diminish what we're saying here, but in our context, growing up, most of us studied Aesop fables, but the fables conveyed a particular moral that the society believed in the context of a story, because it was easier to convey via that way. So what we're saying is that in Genesis 1 to 11, some of these things may be conveying deeper truths. The surface story, whether it's true or not, is not the underlying truth that may not be the underlying truth that the writer is seeking to convey. Because, for example, in the story of Noah, yes, there's a flood, but the message is about the mercy of God and the enduring love of God for humanity, that in spite of humanity going astray, God will always preserve a remnant.
Answers your question, ma'am?
May I ask another question?
Okay.
Maybe I darken the waters a
Before
little
you
more.
ask your question, I have another person who is waiting, Veronica.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. Interesting, but goes beyond intellectual stimulation, because we are talking about the authenticity of our Christian faith. And my question is directed to Reverend Rogers. I noticed that he says that God created humanity. What I'd like to know is whether or not in your frame of belief that God created a finished product, or did he rather create a lesser organism, living organism that over millennia became man? And I ask that because you do say that God created humankind, not man, Adam and Eve. But then last year, during Humanity Sunday in September, you said that you described yourself as an unrepentant evolutionist. So I would like to understand, how do you reconcile both, and why do you say God created humankind as opposed to God created Adam and Eve? And was that creation of God a finished product?
What do you consider, let me ask, what do you consider finished product?
Well, I consider as a finished product the persons that we have been for thousands of years.
All right. So can I use a genetic?
Upright man, I'm saying man in a generic sense, okay?
Yeah, I realize.
Upright Homo sapiens.
Okay, Homo sapiens.
Upright Homo sapiens, cognitive abilities, which is what distinguishes us from the animals. And that I would see as the core, and of course, conscience and a vacuum for the Almighty God, a vacuum to know the Creator. I think those are the distinguishing features of what I think of as man. And the finished product, if we look at the 6-day creation, Adam, Eve, he made them and they were done. Whereas evolution says there were different living organisms, and over time, and I think you said there were 6 different sets of quote unquote mankind. Yeah. So could you reconcile it for me, please?
Okay, first of all, let's just put evolution into context. As I would have mentioned in the sermon that you would have spoken about, the concept of evolution, which I mentioned, is adaptation followed by natural selection, which is what Darwin would have postulated for when he studied the species on the Galapagos Islands. And in that context, I know that we have grown up believing once you hear evolution, it goes against creation. But evolution does not discount creation at all. In fact, when Darwin wrote his Origin of Species, Darwin concluded his Origin of Species in a particular way. If you would permit me to just answer, to read it, if you would. This is the concluding passage of his book. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes and various insects flitting about, with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect on these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. There's a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst the planet has gone cycling on according to its fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So I guess that what Darwin was trying to point out here is that God created forms which evolved over time as conditions changed and they adapted, and certain genes were selected for certain species of the group to carry on beyond, to survive within that environment. And we have seen examples of this adaptation and natural selection taking place, for example, I think in Western Africa, where malaria is rampant, but it's been found that people who have the sickle cell gene can become immune to malaria because they carry that trait. And so naturally what happened over time is natural selection. The members of the population that carry the trait are the ones that will reproduce themselves into the next generation, and the others will die out. And so most of the people in that population have a trait of the sickle cell gene. Now that's just basic. That cannot be described as evolution, because I believe that, as someone rightly pointed out, 1 million years of evolutionary time or 1,000 years of evolutionary time is like the move of a second hand on a clock. So you will not be able to see it within your lifetime. But what I can see is that you mentioned the term Homo sapiens, and you do recognize that that is a construct of classification of hominids, along with Homo neanderthals, Homo denisovan, Homo erectus, and all the others. Just mentioning the term Homo sapiens acknowledges in some way the existence of other hominids. And what we have been seeing now, and this is one of the things I want us to recognize as Christian teachers and Christian leaders at this point in time. Look, we do not have all the answers, but let us recognize that science is not our enemy. Science is seeking to offer answers to questions that we are not asking. And as geneticists are now pointing out, Europeans, for example, and Eurasians carry at least 2% of Homo neanderthal DNA, which means they would have been interbreeding between different groups of hominids. Asians, for example, carry a certain percentage of Homo denisovan DNA, but we're all Homo sapiens. But somehow there's a trait that there were other hominids in existence, and that is new information that is emerging simply because we're now in an era where the human genome has been mapped, and we know a little more about ourselves than we did perhaps 50 to 100 years ago. So I'm just saying that these are things that are there.
Okay,
Yes,
so
may I ask a question that continues on the point of evolution?
okay, just put a spin there for a minute. I think that we will have to have a part 2 of this, because I think we have a lot more to come out. And for time's sake, what I want to do, I don't want to disenfranchise those members of the audience who had questions and comments. So what I will do before you jump in at this time is to go to the chat and just see what is said here so we can deal with it quickly. Someone said, I believe the entire documentation in Genesis 1 to 11. I believe that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant word of God. Another person said, inspired, yes, but is it literal? Inspired and literal are different things. The parable of Jesus, the parables of Jesus are inspired. Are they literal? Are humans literal or not? Was the Good Samaritan an actual literal man? Somebody else said, it is either you believe God and who he is, or you don't. There is no in between. And someone had said, when you answer if man is literal or not, then we can have a discussion. We are not jumping around here. We are addressing truth or lie, yes or no. So then there's a long one, which I wouldn't read. There is a difference between the documentation of creation and the parables of Jesus. A parable is simply that, a parable. Okay. So then the others, the scriptures are way ahead of science, someone said. Science is not our enemy, but it does take preeminence over scriptures. That's another person saying.
Good night. May I ask a question, please?
All right. So now, the person who was waiting in line was
Marshall had my hand up.
no, SPS had their hands up. Long
yes,
time.
That's me.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Hi. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
I want to, okay, first of all, preface my question or my comment with what Dr. George Wall said. He was an evolutionist, biologist, and he said there are really only two ways of looking at the origin of life on Earth. It is either creation or evolution. He said there's no third way. And when we look at the Bible gives a creation account without any evolutionary ancestors to man. Adam was made as Adam, man, perfect, and Eve. There were no evolutionary ancestors. It is only because of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that a number of theologians thought that science proved evolution, and therefore this had to be the way God created through evolution. But there's no scientific evidence for evolution whatsoever. For example, Reverend Rogers, in his sermon, and I will quote him here, he says, when we reflect on the archaeological studies and the field of anthropology, the oldest ancestor of human beings was found in Africa in Ethiopia, Australopithecus afarensis, 3.2 million years ago. And this fossil, which was discovered by Donald Johanson back in the 70s, was regarded as a missing link between apes or ape-like creatures and humans, because humans are, in the evolutionary scheme of things, are believed to have evolved from a common ancestor with apes. And the whole thing about hominids, Reverend Rogers spoke of hominids. The whole point of hominids, the whole hominid taxonomy is a mixture of authentic human fossils with ape-like fossils, and they put them together and call them hominids. Okay, it's a wrong way of looking at the evidence. The scientific evidence shows that humankind has always been humankind. Australopithecus afarensis has since subsequently been disproven as being a missing link between ape-like creatures and humans, because it was thought to have walked upright, but we know chimpanzees walk upright and they're not becoming human. Further discoveries have shown that Australopithecus afarensis had a locking wrist like a regular quadruped ape. It was actually an ape. It has shoulders like a gorilla. It was fitted for tree swinging. It was an ape, okay, an extinct ape. And in the fossil record, there have been discoveries showing that what we call Homo sapiens, modern humans, existed in the fossil record even before Australopithecus afarensis, dated at 3.2 million years. There has been a fossil found dated about 4.5 million years. Is the lower end of an upper arm. It's the Kenopoi elbow fossil discovered in Kenya, dated at 4.5 million years. And evolutionists themselves say it is indistinguishable from modern human elbow, as well as the Luatoli footprints in Tanzania. They are indistinguishable from Homo sapiens walking barefoot. In fact, one evolutionist said that if you were to take away the time element, he would have to say these were made by Homo sapiens. It's only because it is said to be in a strata dated at 4.5 million years ago. It couldn't be Homo sapiens. It couldn't be modern humans because they weren't around then. But it is looking at the evidence wrong. In fact, the fossil layers, the rock layers aren't that old at all. And we can't have time to go into the dating of the Earth, but the ages are incorrect according to the evolutionary time scale. And if we look, genetics is now showing that humankind, we are all descended, all humans on Earth can trace themselves back to one woman, mitochondrial Eve. And all men can be traced back to one man, Y chromosome Adam. And really and truthfully, even some evolutionists have pointed out that depending on how you look at the molecular clock and how it is calibrated, depending on how you look at it, but really and truthfully, whereas mitochondrial Eve or Y chromosome Adam is said to have 100 to 200,000 years ago, if you look at the calibration in a different way, we can end up with about 6,000 years ago, which comes in the ballpark of what Genesis says. The point is that Genesis says Adam was made as man without any evolutionary ancestors. But I know Reverend Rogers holds to theistic evolution. He believes that ape-like creatures evolved into human beings. But that's because he believes that evolution is true. But there's no scientific evidence that evolution is true.
I don't think anyone.
In fact, Charles Darwin himself said that, and I'm quoting him, he said, I'm quoting from his book, Origin of Species, page 292. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. There are no missing links.
As he rightly pointed out, it's a theory. Evolution is a theory. No one can prove it in their lifetime. What I have pointed out, and you alluded to, when I mentioned Australopithecus, it is believed within scientific circles that Australopithecus, the Australopithecine line, is the lineage from which the Homo genera emerged. And as I would have pointed out in reference to Sister Veronica not long ago, there seems to be evidence in the genetic details now that there was interbreeding between various hominids within the world. That's just what the science is showing. I'm not saying it is right or wrong, it's just showing that. And it would be good for us as a Christian people to start wrapping our minds around these things.
Interbreeding is really between Neanderthals and what we call Homo sapiens, but really
Homo sapiens.
The Neanderthals were really Homo sapiens with a different morphology. That's all.
All right.
Neanderthals were perfectly human. They buried their dead. They painted. They were just like you and I. And in fact, if you were to look at how Neanderthal was first depicted by evolutionists, it was a very brutish ape-like looking creature. But the new discoveries, if you look at a Neanderthal depiction, he's perfectly human, just like you and I, just with heavier brow ridges and stuff like that.
Right, precisely.
And there is evidence because of climatic conditions and stuff like that, why he would have had heavier brow ridges. In fact, I've seen a human being today with heavy brow ridges, but he's not a Neanderthal.
Thank you, Roger. That was really very engaging. So
may I also ask a question?
And I want us to be brief because we have Mark Ford here waiting and Shem White waiting for a while.
Yeah, my question is just a few seconds long. Yeah, Romans chapter 5, verse 12 says that by one man sin entered into the world and death by sin. So what I want to ask is, if we accept the evolutionary interpretation of the origin of human beings, what caused death to come into the world? From an evolutionary perspective, what was the cause of death? The reason I'm asking that question is that it is closely connected to why Jesus came. According to the scripture, sin was the cause of death. But evolutionists don't believe in sin. I mean, the atheistic evolutionists, they don't believe in sin. Right. They don't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. So I want to know, if there was death before Adam and Eve, if there was death before the first human beings recorded in Genesis, then what was the cause of death? If it was not sin, then why did Jesus have to die in order to get us forgiven and have eternal life restored?
Right.
Could you have that question answered?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did raise that issue in my opening statements because I did say not to accept that Adam was a literal person would skew a number of the other biblical teachings that we hold to. And I did mention the fall as well, because Adam was created perfect, but because of the fall, because of sin, he fell from that state of holiness. So I am in support of your line of argument, actually, personally.
That is one reason I don't believe in evolution, because if you believe in evolution, then you cannot really say that sin was the cause of death. And if that is not the case, then Jesus did not have to die.
Okay. All right, Shem, you jump in here and ask your question, be brief.
Yes, please. Good night to the panel. I just want to ask a question to Reverend Rogers, and I guess any of the other panelists can answer. So in his statement, he said that if that was 2 weeks ago, he said that if he was in a theological class or at seminary, he would say what he said, and he was basically speaking to the congregation who may not understand the systematics and the particulars of the theology. And you mentioned in your introductory speech that whatever comes from the seminary comes comes out of the institution, even into the congregation, especially in this time. So my question is, should we draw the line of the systematic and the particular theology? For example, should we draw the line between the systematic theology and the practical theology? For example, should we only do the preaching and the preaching of the word of God, teaching salvation, or should we enter in and bring the systematic theology? And if we should not draw the line, and if we should draw the line, where should we draw the line?
Why do you have to draw a line at all? The reason I raised that is because one of the things we have to recognize as a Christian people is that God is constantly revealing himself in every epoch of time. It is for people in every generation to recognize him and recognize how he acts in our particular time and what he's calling us to believe and to see. For example, in the Genesis story, they did not have a concept of the universe or the world as we did. And so worldviews are important. And that's something that Jesus encountered during his time, because Jesus, as I said, was called Beelzebub and all kinds of things because he brought a new revelation of God that the old school did not embrace. And so, whereas one of the critical points of Jewish religion was their food laws and clean and unclean animals and all those things, Jesus came and tore that down, because by now the understanding of humanity is not just a physical relationship with God, but there's something called the psyche, or the soul, or what we refer to as psyche. And so it is that is important now, and that is essential to knit to God. So it's not what goes into the man that defiles the man, but what comes out. And similar things like that, because he was challenging the status quo of his time to experience God as he constantly revealed himself. And perhaps that's something we have to be wary of as well, that though Hebrews 13:8 says Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, human understanding and perception of him cannot be the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Mark Ford.
Hey, good night. 1 minute. Yeah, hey, good night. I had put down my hand initially because my question was pretty much along the same lines as Joseph Buckland with regards to Romans 5 and the implications if the first 11 chapters of Genesis are in fact a myth, right? To my mind, in my line of thinking, my thought process, if we're regarding the first 11 chapters of Genesis as a myth, by Romans 5, then Jesus came to die on account of myth, right? If by one man's sin, Adam isn't necessarily literal. The superintendent, Reverend Dr. Cumberbatch, would have addressed it. However, I don't think I heard Reverend Dr. Rogers address it when Mr. Buckland would have raised it. So I just raised my hand so I could hear Reverend Dr. Rogers' opinion, his take on the situation. Did Jesus die on account of myth? Right. So yeah, that's pretty much my question.
Okay. as I pointed out, the worldview of the Bible sees Genesis 1 through to 11 as truth. It is true, it is their history, it is what they believe. And so for Romans 5 to say through one man came death, through Adam came death, Adam here represents Adama, the one who came out of the dust, the progenitor of the human race. And the point he's making here is comparing that which is of flesh to that which is of spirit. It is a deeper truth being conveyed. So Jesus initiates a new creation. That is why we speak of anyone in Christ, he's a new creation, etc. He initiates a new creation, not bound by the flesh, but bound by the spirit. And so the deeper theological truth is a comparison between flesh and spirit. But for them, it was true.
With due respect, I think the point is not being seen. I want you to tell us, Dr. Rogers, I want you to tell us, according to what you have learned or what you have studied, from an evolutionary perspective, what was really the cause of death? How did death come into the world, evolutionary speaking?
Well, evolution doesn't seek to answer that question. That is a theological question.
Because
which is answered along theological lines.
The reason I ask is that it has been seen that there are teeth marks in certain fossils. There is also evidence of cancer in certain fossils that have been found. And these fossils are dated long before the Genesis timeline of Adam and Eve. So the evidence is that there was death. If you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, before Adam and Eve. So with that in mind, why would Jesus have to die for humanity's sin if there was no such thing as Adam and no such person as Eve and no first act of transgression in disobeying God?
Okay.
And death did not really come about as a result of Adam's transgression. Why would there be a need for Jesus to die to bring us the hope of eternal life?
Okay. Because Jesus died for the sins of humanity.
But that is based upon the belief that Adam brought sin, and sin brought death into the world, and that the solution is for
remember that according to Genesis 1, there's no Adam and Eve. Genesis 1 doesn't mention them. It mentions male and female. It created humanity. The Adam and Eve concept comes from Genesis 2. But you did mention that in Romans 5, Jesus mentioned the first sin came through Adam. And that is because Adam is referred to as the progenitor of humanity. And so sin came into the world through humanity's rebellion against God.
Okay, so you don't believe that there was a literal individual being called Adam. You believe he just represents humanity.
In Genesis 2, if you take Genesis 2 literally, there is. I don't take it literally.
Then how come Jesus traces his ancestry back to Adam in Luke chapter 3? If there were no historical Adam, then there'd be no historical Jesus.
Remember, the writer of St. Luke's gospel is writing a history to link his community to the past. The truth of the past is that Adam is the progenitor of humanity. So naturally, he will do it. Okay. We're dealing with a worldview of a people.
But if that worldview is not real, if it is not factual, if it does not exist in reality, then on what basis would Jesus have to die? What good would his death do for people who are in the world today?
the worldview is real for the people for whom it is written and who are engaging with it. And as I'm pointing out, in our time, the concept of the Adam is the progenitor of all humanity, and death came into the world through humanity's fall from grace.
All right, let me ask a question, Dr. Rogers, before I get, I see Veronica's hands up. What is your view? You keep saying about the worldview. What is your view? Of the same issue we're discussing there with the doctor.
As I said, worldview really means what is the concept?
What is your view, not what is worldview? What is your view?
Of what in particular?
Of death. Why would death come? What caused death?
Death is brought about and through humanity's separation from its creator, humanity's separation from God. You see, in the Hebrew context, as opposed to the other cultures of their time, in the Akkadian account of creation, human beings are created to serve the gods. And it is when the human beings do not work hard enough for the gods and are not feeding the gods properly, but the gods decide that they must be destroyed and this flood comes and so on. In the Hebrew understanding of the relationship between God and humanity, it is not like that. Humanity is not created to cook food for the gods and all those things. Humanity is created to serve God and to care for God's creation. It is when humanity rebels against doing that and seeks to become God or project himself as God, or to do the things that would make him seem as though he is equated with God, that humanity falls from his grace. And that is the sin, when we become separated from God. And sin is death. It is separation.
Okay, just one more question because we have 5 more minutes before we wrap up, and I'm gonna get it from Veronica, but I wanna ask you, Dr. Rogers, you used 2 terms there. You said humanity was not created to feed the gods, but then you talk about singular God. So I'm trying to figure out,
Okay, in ancient Near Eastern cultures, most of them believed in the divine assembly, a pantheon of gods. And in the Gilgamesh story, for example, of the flood, it is one of the gods who betrays the divine assembly and comes and tells this human being, Unakishtan, listen, the fellows are planning to destroy the earth with a flood. Go and build this ark, line it with bitumen, put animals in it, make sure you cover yourself and your family, and so on. Because in that story, they believe in a pantheon of gods. In the Hebrew religion, they never believed in a pantheon of gods. They believed only in one God. And therefore, that's what Wellhausen called it. They practiced monolatry, in that they believed in one God while they acknowledged that the rest of their neighbors had gods themselves, but they did not serve them. They served and acknowledged only one. So in the accounts of Genesis 1-11, only one God is portrayed, even though different sources portray him in a different way, which is too much to go into now. But if you read the story of Noah in Genesis 6-9, you have two different sources speaking of the divine with different terms. There's Elohim and there's Yahweh. And in one, Yahweh tells Noah to put 7 pairs of clean animals in the ark. Of every clean animal, put 7 pairs. Whereas God tells him only put a pair of clean and unclean animals. But that has to do with the concept of sacrifice, because in the concept of the view of Yahweh, the Yahwistic group, Noah has to come out to the ark and sacrifice animals to God. And so he has to carry some extra pairs of the clean ones. Whereas in the priestly group, which only mentions God, Noah cannot sacrifice anything, because sacrifice begins with the priesthood with Moses, and that hasn't come yet. So there are nuances in the text that,
Okay, thank you so much. And Veronica, could you make your question brief? And then we will have each panelist to give their closing comments. taking into consideration the subject at hand. Veronica?
Thank you so much. And I'll be brief. I just wanted to know if Satan, who, well, I grew up thinking of as a singular entity and God's arch enemy, is Satan a myth? Is Satan fact or truth? Because I know you distinguish a lot between fact and truth, and I can follow that argument. And secondly, what happens to human beings after they die? Is there a hell and is there a heaven? And what about the sacrifice of Christ? Was that necessary?
That's for me.
Yes, please. Or
These
anybody.
difficult questions.
Anybody can jump in.
Anybody,
Up to
because
panelists.
I know that you have 2 different or 3 different perspectives, and I would really like to hear all.
And I would like you all to keep them brief, please.
All right.
Well, I think that's the subject of another program, though. That's a very big subject. But you know, just as there's a kingdom of light headed by God, there's a kingdom of darkness headed by Satan. I know the whole question of demonology is a very, very, very big subject, but it's a real kingdom. Some people dismiss it, but Satan is also at work in the world through his demonic forces as well. But that's the subject of another that's the subject of another program.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that God is all powerful. And as the scripture says, the very demons tremble at the sound of the name of Jesus. But that's a separate program.
Okay.
All right,
Aaron,
I would just, yes, please. I would like to
Thank
make a contribution here.
let's make it brief before we.
There is a notion among theologians that the universe is a closed system into which nothing supernatural can enter. As a matter of fact, God cannot even enter. And I think that to hold such a position is quite a slippery slope, because one wonders then how we arrive at evil and how has evil entered in the world, into the world, and why do people do evil things, etc., etc. I believe that this believing the traditional understanding of the book of Genesis is therefore important in explaining the presence of evil, explaining, as others were asking the entire night, explaining the origin of sin, etc., etc. So I think that there's more credence in holding such a position.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Rogers.
Well, it comes down to the basic message that I was saying. The book of Genesis conveys certain truths which are necessary and form the foundation of what would be the religion of the people of Israel and ultimately Christianity. And you cannot get away from those truths, those deep theological points that are being made in the text. And I think that that is what the main crux of the text is about. Whether it should be taken literally or not is a different matter. But I think we can all agree that the fundamental truths of what Genesis put forth are what form the basis of Hebrew religion and ultimately forms the basis of Christianity.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think I answered the question, but nonetheless. Yes, there is a devil, there is a Satan, yes.
Okay, so what I want to get from you gentlemen, if you will be available for part 2 next month, say.
Once I have early notification as to the time, because my schedule is very
I could actually name a date now, say the 22nd of March, which is the Tuesday.
Yeah.
That'd be good for you.
I can make myself available.
I'll make myself available, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so the 22nd of March, 6:30, and then I will obviously follow up with you. So your parting comments and taking into consideration the subject, the genesis of man, biblical fact or fiction, and if you can do it, like say in a minute and a half, each person. So we start with Reverend Rogers.
Well, the topic, Genesis of man, biblical fact or fiction. The genesis of man is that, as the book of Genesis says, God created man, and we believe that he created us in his image. What is this image? Is it a physical thing or is it a spiritual thing? These are matters for theologians to discuss, but certainly the fundamental truth is that God created humanity. And that is the crux of the message.
Reverend Downs?
Yes, please. I definitely would agree that the creation story is a fact and not a myth. I think that everything else that is written thereafter depends on it. I think that Jesus supports the idea. I think the Apostle Paul supported the idea, and John supported the idea. And I think that the whole idea of creation, the creation itself supports the idea, because design suggests a designer, and we cannot contemplate how something as sophisticated as the world could exist except there be a creator or a designer, and hence that is the foundation of my belief.
Thank you so much. Reverend Cumberbatch.
I would concur with those who went before me. To my mind, it's important that we get it right from the beginning, because the truth is, if we are skewed with respect to who God is and what he has done in terms of his creation, it's highly unlikely that we would come to some very, very skewed positions relative to some of those key doctrines that we talked about. But I enjoyed the interaction, and we look forward to the follow-up session next time around.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, and all those who joined us online. I really, really appreciate it, and the provocative questions and the interaction. And I'm sure that we will leave here more enlightened. Our knowledge will be expanded, even though we might disagree in certain areas. At least it will send us off to do our research and give a lot more thought to this Christian life and to the Bible and to God and so on, to really look deeper into what we are actually a part of, rather than this a superficial point of view. And at this time, I would ask our senior pastor at Cayfield Wesleyan, Reverend Kwesi Jones, to have the last word and prayer.
Good night, everyone. I am just going to be, well, a little brief, but I'm going to leave two quotations with us. One is rooted in what we believe is a Wesleyan community. It says that we believe that the books of the Old and New Testament constitute the Holy Scriptures. They are the inspired and infallibly written Word of God, fully inerrant in their original manuscripts and superior to all human authority, and have been transmitted to the present without corruption of any essential doctrine. I think that is one of the things we need to consider as we think about what we believe. As those of us who are Wesleyans or Nazarenes, if I'm going to go down that road, we've got to be very careful of what we accept as our belief and how we promote that in what we say and what we do. But beyond that, I'm going to also read a quotation from the book, How Now Shall We Live, written by Charles Colson and Nancy Piercy. And it's talking about the culture wars that we find ourselves in. And they wrote on page 17, our calling, I quote, our calling is not only to order our lives by divine principles, but also to engage the world as Crespo did. Excuse me. We are to fulfill both the Great Commission and the Cultural Commission. We are commanded both to preach the good news and to bring all things into submission to God's order by defending and living out God's truth in the unique historical and cultural conditions of our age. To engage the world, however, requires that we understand the great ideas that compete for people's minds and hearts. Philosopher Richard Weaver has it right in the title of his well-known book, Ideas Have Consequences. It is the great ideas that inform the mind, fire the imagination, move the heart, and shape a culture. History is little more than the recording of the rise and fall of the great ideas, the worldviews that form our values and move us to act. A debilitating weakness in modern evangelism is that we've been fighting cultural skirmishes on all sides without knowing what the war itself is about. We have not identified the worldviews that lie at the root of cultural conflict, and this ignorance dooms our best effort. I'm going to close shortly. The culture war is not just about abortion, homosexual rights, or the decline of public education. These are only the skirmishes. The real war is a cosmic struggle between worldviews, between the Christian worldview and the various secular and spiritual worldviews arrayed against it. This is what we must understand if we are going to be effective both in evangelizing our world today and in transforming it to reflect the wisdom of the Creator. I want to deal with the wisdom of the Creator. And from our discussions tonight, I am more than convinced that we serve a God who created, and his creation will continue to exalt him as we give him the chance to. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for bringing us together tonight, and we thank you for this discussion that you've allowed us to have. We thank you that in the midst of things that we may have said that we may not, some of us may disagree with, and some of us may agree with, that over all of this is the bounds of love, because you're calling on us to love each other and to care for each other and to reflect the love of Jesus Christ in our hearts, even when we disagree. And so I thank you for Reverend Rogers and Reverend Downs and Reverend Cumberbatch, who led us so beautifully tonight and caused us as a church to begin to reflect on the deeper messages that you have written for us in your word. Yes, some of us, many of us, will agree with the creation narrative. Some of us will be thinking about the messages that they have posted to us and caused us to reflect on. But God, as we consider all of that, we all would agree that Jesus Christ is superior to all of those discussions because he came as a sacrificial lamb to deal with the issue of death and sin and destruction. And so as we go to our various, as we leave this platform tonight, as we reflect on what was discussed, cause us, God, to above all think about the work of Jesus Christ and the work that he continues to do in our lives, and cause us to love and respect and honor him with our actions and with what we do. Bless us as a Christian community. Bless us as a community of believers, a community of faith, and cause us as we struggle with these issues to continue to look to your word and to you for direction, for help, for leadership, and for healing. We give you thanks for a wonderful time this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And amen.
Amen.